I'd like to say good afternoon to everyone wherever you might be. I'm in the southeast right now, and we've got some storms rolling through a little bit later on, but that's kind of what happens in the spring. Relax, enjoy, feel like you're having a cup of coffee with a friend. That's what that little graphic's for, a little virtual caffeine that we can all enjoy together. I'm Damian Cavanaugh, and my background is in independent education. I went to an independent school, as did my 5 brothers and sisters. I've worked in 2 independent schools as a teacher, administrator, coach, a headmaster, and now I serve schools with SAIS, working in the accreditation department to help manage the process and help both visiting teams go through it as well as schools go through it. SAIS is a pretty big network of about 365 member schools throughout 13 states and 4 countries. And we really like to say that we meet schools where they are and serve their needs where they are. So what I want to do today is I want to start off by first saying I know that I am speaking to a group of experts, so I appreciate your patience with me as I go through what I think I'm probably expert in, which is how the mission and some accreditation data really intersect with some things that you all might be doing and might be seeing in admissions. And we'll take a look at some data specifically, and I will make some broad pronunciations as well that you all in the Q&A session and later on as I might see you are welcome to object to as vigorously as you would like. What I want to do is I want to start off with something. This basic concept of what change looks like. And this is actually a picture of pretty much the same event that was separated by 8 years. So on the left-hand side, you're looking at Pope Benedict's installation in 2005, and on the right-hand side, you're looking at Pope Francis's installation in 2013. And you can tell pretty easily what the difference is. There are quite a number of devices of one kind or another on the right-hand side. And sure, we all know, we've been exposed to this plenty long enough, that the digital revolution is here. It's here to stay. You all are clearly experts in how you have migrated admissions processes and migrated the new way of doing admissions using online tools. And there are great organizations like SSATBE to provide some really good high-level professional development to help make these things happen. But this talk today is more than just how things change. It's really about what's fundamental and what really doesn't change. And I can't resist showing you this one picture, another change picture for you. And I hope you can tell what you're looking at. I took this picture myself traveling back from a rural school that I was visiting. And what you're seeing is one of those Google map markers there that's life-size. It was on the side of the road, and it caught my attention so much that I pulled over and took a picture of it. It's in front of some health center or something that looks like it's under construction. But the point of this is to show you just how pervasive Google is as a source of information. It's everywhere, and everybody knows what it means. But your information doesn't necessarily come from Uncle Google in the same way. So it begs this basic question of, well, where do you get information from? And how does it help you inform the decisions that you make? And there are great traditional sources that you all already have that again, you all are professionals in, things like demographics or inquiries or applications, the offers you make, the yield, other things like graduation-related statistics and college acceptances and maybe some money that comes in for college scholarships, those types of things. And that's when we think about where data comes from that we normally tend to think of it. But think a little bit more broadly outside of those types of operational issues to where data comes from when we try and establish what we've taken to call your value narrative. In other words, what is it that people really think about your school, what you're doing, and how well do they know what you're actually performing on? And this is a question that I ask quite a bit. And I actually know where most data comes from in schools. And I've got a picture that illustrates exactly where most of our information comes from about what's going on in schools. So for the most part, information comes from pretty unreliable sources, from conversations we might have in the in carpool line or at the ball games, or as I've heard someone refer to it, the Publix or the Kroger Mafia. And for the most part, this is where a lot of the information comes from that we get in schools today. We talk a good bit in SAIS about the difference between loud data and good data, and trying to figure out how you actually measure the things that really matter. And for us, of course, and for all independent schools, we think it's the mission that really matters. So it begs this really basic question: how can you listen, and then what, in fact, will you hear? So one of the things that SAIS has developed is this really powerful value narrative tool that I will be summarizing, hey, at the SSATBE conference. So here's a shameless plug for the conference for everybody. It's coming up in September. Registration opens up not too long from now. But the presentation I'll give there is really about data, and it's about understanding data. We're going to talk about survey fatigue and norms and stanines and reliability, and my personal favorite, z-scores. If you don't know what a z-score is, feel free to come to this presentation and I will be happy to tell you all about what a z-score is. But really what we want to work on is missions. So I'm going to segue, and you see that's a segue back to mission. What we want to do is we want to take just a look at some of the different types of missions that are out there. And if you have had the opportunity to read a lot of mission statements the way we tend to get to read a lot in the association world or in or through the process of accreditation, you'll know that they do come in all shapes and sizes. They're the very short kinds of mission statements like the one on your screen. The mission of the school is to enrich minds and inspire dreams. Okay? Or a mission like this one: the school educates students to think critically, to lead confidently, and to live honorably. Great. Well, we also know that mission statements, some are significantly longer than others. I'm not going to read this one to you, but I will point out that that sometimes the missions that we look at are much longer than others, and our job in SAIS and in most organizations that support schools is, so long as the mission is legal and ethical, we'll do everything that we can to support it. What I want to take you through is actually a mission activity that tries to talk specifically about what's called face validity. So the term face validity means, can you put something in front of lots of different groups of people and they will roughly understand it to be the same thing or to mean the same thing. And this activity that we've conducted well over 100 times is something that we do routinely in workshops, and it's something that's neatly replicated in the first part of accreditation visits, where the chair of the visiting team will send a note out to the team and say something like, thanks so much for serving. Hey, here's the mission of the school that we're going to go visit. And before you Google it, before you really know too much about the school, just think about what you expect to see before you get there. So in the workshop environment, what we'll do is an activity with this particular mission. The mission of the school is to enrich minds and inspire dreams. And the question is really this: just imagine what you expect to see based entirely on that mission and based only on that mission. So some leading questions might be, as you can see there, do you anticipate the school to be in an urban, suburban, rural environment? What's the teaching like? What's the background of the teachers who are teaching in the school? What are the families like? What does it cost? These are a series of questions that we ask, and when school people are together in small groups of, say, 5 or 6 or 8 or so in a group, what we'll do is we'll allow them to go through this for about 5 to 10 minutes or so and really dig into the heart of what this mission is trying to tell them. Now, we're not going to take the 5 or 10 minutes right now, but just know that you can, in fact, do this on your own at some point if you want to. But what I'll do is I'll summarize some of what we've heard before, and also I'll probably catch a number of the elements that you probably decided when you looked at this initially. Lots of times we hear that people will say, well, this school is very student-focused. The teachers are highly qualified professionals. Maybe they've got some pretty good art programs that are going on at the school. Those are the types of things that we hear. Very student-focused, progressive. We typically hear that it's a pretty expensive school. People will normally say it's got a very high tuition, and then we'll dig into that a little bit, and based on whatever market they're in, they'll give a range of a number of what that means, you know, ranging from $10,000 to $30,000, just depending on the market. And then we'll get into this idea of, well, is that the cost to educate a student, or is that actually the tuition of what people are paying? Which leads us into a good talk about the gap between those two. Occasionally, though, we'll get something that's really interesting, and if we don't get it immediately, we'll usually fish for it a little bit. Occasionally, we'll get people who say something like, well, this school is an inner city school, or it's an urban school that serves socioeconomically disadvantaged students. Okay. And you know, that tends to be a model that's a low to no tuition model. But when that comes up, and it almost always comes up, I get a chance to ask the question, now wait a minute, is that the way mission statements actually work? In other words, do you normally and routinely try to say, hey, I'm going to look for students who don't actually meet the mission because they don't have the opportunity to do so, and I'm going to see if we can, as a school, get them to a different point? Or do we say, we normally take students who already have a proclivity or a tendency towards whatever our mission is, and we continue from that point forward? And after thinking about it a little bit, almost everyone says, you know, it really is the second, that there's an intersection between missions and admissions, which says, you know, this actually does describe somewhat of the student profile that we're looking for. So if we step back from this mission statement, which is clearly an aspirational mission and not necessarily very operational in its nature, and we say, how does it really work when you try and line those two up? For the most part, people will say, you know, there actually is an overlap there, and now that I step back and rethink about what you just said, this mission of this school is less likely to be of what I thought it might be. I don't think this school is necessarily one of these, you know, urban poor type schools. And if you then wrap around it, this is absolutely an independent school, a non-profit, non-public school. That also changes what people think. So this mission statement actually does have what's called face validity. In other words, in the, I don't know, 120 or so, 150 times that we've done this activity, about 90 to 95% of the times, people will operationalize this mission in almost the exact same way. And that is actually pretty interesting, because it leads us then into the next phase of this overall activity, which is, you know, how well do you know your own school's mission, and can you write it down? And so in the virtual world, we're not actually going to make you do this, so you're not going to be tested on it. But in the workshop environment, we do write it out, and we see, you know, and we can make some really good decisions and good judgments about just how well people do in fact know their mission, which then leads us to pick it apart and say, now, what are the overall pieces of this mission that can be measured? And for the purposes of today's conversation, what are the overall pieces of your own mission that suggest how you might develop your admissions profile, and how you might develop your portrait of the candidate? When we give this activity in small groups, we do one more face validity activity where, and you can see what it is here, since everyone at a table, if they're not from the same school, has written down their mission, we then say, okay, now take the mission of one of the schools and try and visualize what you might see if you were to go to that school. And it's another way to establish some face validity, or establish that face validity might not exist. One of the things that we've definitely noticed this day and age, is that mission statements tend to be tripartite. In other words, they tend to have some sort of foundational statement which really lays out something, some core principle or belief of the school. Then they tend to talk about some kind of outcome for students, and then they tend to talk about some operational methodology of how they're actually going to get there. So you can think about your own school's mission statement, and maybe you could pull it up on a device or on your computer somewhere, and you could just judge and test, hey, does that actually make sense? Does that ring true with what our mission statement is? And the three mission statements that I showed you are from different eras, different periods of time. They are real mission statements. The really long one was probably created in about 40, 50, 60 years ago or so, and comes from an era and a time when maybe folks weren't as overly concerned with economy of words, let's say. So it's not really a marketing mission. It's something that says, hey, let's just put everything that we do down on paper because people in our environment and in our community are actually going to bother to read the whole thing. Okay. Then we get to the really short mission statement that we used on purpose as a guide for this activity. And what that school did is they said, well, let's look at everything that we believe, everything that we do. Let's throw it all up on the wall and see, can we whittle away at it until we just get at the core of who we actually are. So those are a couple different ways to go about it. And this webinar is not about a mission rewrite, but it is about the intersection of how mission does guide everything that you might do in a school, specifically relative to this group, admissions. So since we're virtual, we're going to go ahead and turn and look at a couple of direct missions really quickly. We'll just look at three of them. So these are real missions. These are modern missions. The only thing that's redacted is the name of the specific school. So I found these three to be pretty exciting and pretty interesting, and we'll go through them. I know that you can read it, but in case you happen to be listening to this later on, I'll go ahead and read through it for you. The mission of the school is to improve the fabric of society by graduating compassionate, educated individuals capable of independent thinking and innovative ideas. To this end, the school seeks to attract, nurture, and challenge students whose commitment to truth, knowledge, and honor will prepare them, not only for the most rigorous college programs, but also for productive lives. This is a fascinating mission statement which speaks directly to the admissions process. To this end, the school seeks to attract, and it lays out exactly what the school's going after. I do find this a fascinating mission that really is being used, and I happen to know this school pretty well, is being used to define and to help elevate everything that's going on in the particular school. Moving on to another one. The school exists to inspire in its students a passion for learning, a commitment to personal integrity, and a sense of social responsibility. So again, another really interesting mission statement that might suggest the type of student that you're looking for in the admissions protocol. Begs some basic questions, though. How do you assess passion for learning? How do you assess commitment to personal integrity? And how do you assess sense of social responsibility? Is it incumbent upon the school to say, no, these are all outcomes. We don't care what you come in with. We know what you're going to leave with. Or is it incumbent upon the school to say, look, these are the types of candidates that we're most interested in dealing with, so let's figure out how we can screen for this on the front end. This last one is I think it's probably a really traditional mission statement that probably matches up with the pattern of most independent schools, and it lays out some pretty key elements here. By balancing academics, arts, athletics, and religion, the school prepares students for a college that best suits his or her unique gifts while providing moral and intellectual constructs that will help each graduate become an active, discerning, faithful, loving, hope-filled citizen of our country and of the world. So to some extent, there's a past, present, and future that's embedded in this particular mission statement that talks about multiple dimensions and multiple elements for who a student actually is and what a student might actually look like. What we're going to do next is we're actually going to move into some pretty specific data that's been gleaned from looking at some responses that we've seen through the accreditation process. But before we do that, if there are any questions that have rolled in, this is actually going to be a pretty good moment to take a look at some questions really quickly. So Karen, is there anything at this point that that we need to follow up on?
No, Damien, we don't have anything right now, so you can keep moving forward.
Well, that sounds great. So those questions, these questions lead us into, all right, there's the segue again, because we're going to segue into some accreditation research. And let me tell you the methodology for what we've done in some of the accreditation research. So as an independent school, you go through an accreditation visit, depending on who your accreditor is, on a 5-year cycle, a 6-year, 7-year, a 10-year cycle. It may be something along those lines. It varies from association to association. All the associations that are part of the independent school world or part of the NAIS community and the Commission on Accreditation have a set of standards that are fairly similar to each other. We all adhere to a set of what's called the model core standards. We all comply with a set of criteria. But inside of the standards and indicators, there are always several that talk specifically about the admissions process to some extent. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at just the two standards in SAIS that talk specifically about it, and I'll share with you some of the things that we've seen that are commonalities in responses and some of the things that we don't see too often. Also, as part of accreditation, there's always a growth component to accreditation, regardless of the protocol that you're part of, and there are strategic goals that are listed. It's part of the self-study, the school improvement plan. There are lots of different names for it. But another piece of research that I'll share with you is just looking at the last couple of years of goals and strategic plans that some schools in SAIS have put forward, just as a way to get a very quick thumbnail sketch overall of some trends in independent schools. And SAIS, again, is a pretty big, robust network. So the data is from about 150 to 160 or so schools over the last couple of years that have gone through the accreditation process. So it's probably pretty good data. We've got a wide range of different types of schools, from boarding to day to faith-based schools and secular schools and small schools, big schools, K-8s, K-12s. So looking at the data from a global point of view does make a little bit of sense. So two of the indicators that we're going to look like are under what we call Standard 5, which is our sort of the operational standard, if you will. And here are the two that are up here, 5.7 and 5.8, that do work in connection with each other. So 5.7 talks specifically about the operational protocols and operational processes that schools have that have to be, you can see, well-defined, published admissions and FA process that include criteria upon which decisions are made. Okay, and 5.8 says accept students for whom there is a reasonable expectation of success from the program. And actually what we found is that while 5.7 defines a lot of the operational protocols, 5.8 is actually a lot more interesting for us to do some research on, to read all of the responses that we've gotten and try and see what are some trends, and can we tease out either some best practices or some not so good practices just by examining some of these things. So here's the first bit. What's normal? What do we see a lot of as we read through the responses that schools give to these indicators? Well, none of this will surprise you as to what's normal in the process that you follow to go through admissions. What we see that you tend to look at the big three here: academics, behavior, and potential contribution. Okay, that seems to make a lot of sense. So what are some of the indicators that we see that schools are using to judge whether a student is academically qualified, behaviorally qualified, and might be able to contribute? Well, as you can imagine, under academics, there are all kinds of tests, grades, standardized scores, writing samples. Under behavior, a lot of times what we saw is a lack of discipline issues. So if someone's coming from a public school, no referrals or something like that, which is kind of an interesting way to phrase it from an admissions protocol, that there are things that you are looking for that might disqualify, as opposed to things that might qualify. But that may not be terribly surprising to you all, because you have to be as discerning as you can, especially if you've got a healthy candidate pool. Some of the other things that we see from a behavior point of view are a couple different types of observations. Either the admissions director, someone's on the admissions team, goes into schools and does observations in a native environment, if you will, or, as is really common, some shadowing or some observations in your own school that go on. And in reading through it, we saw a wide range of observations that take place, and the admissions professionals that you all are, you probably trade notes about this and are pretty familiar with what you see around you. But we saw some things that struck us as we did this research. Some of the observations are defined as, a 30-minute observation or an hour-long observation, and some even extend to 3 days of observations. One that I saw that was pretty unique, because I don't know how many have the opportunity to do this. A school that's really a K-5 or K-6 school does have a preschool for which there are no entry requirements. It's wide open to the public. And so students who are coming from preschool into the school's kindergarten, they have to apply like anybody else. But essentially and effectively, they've had an entire year to observe that student. So there's a pretty good idea if the student's going to be qualified to attend or not. And then there are these potential other contributions, as you can see: athletics, arts, other. These are, we tend to be need blind, so let's hope we're not making decisions based on potential monetary contributions. But these are just some of the norms that we see that are there. And even when you read through a lot of different things, and if you had to describe your process to somebody else, whether it's keeping it updated on your website or putting in your print materials, a lot of it actually tends to focus on the academics and really tends to downplay everything else. So our focus on grades and standardized scores is about 90–95% of what was written in responding to these indicators really focused on how intensely people use grades and what they use them for, which I found is pretty interesting. But I think we can explain that most independent schools are college prep schools, so that does tend to be a pretty common threshold that you have to be able to do the work in order to get beyond that. So a real question is, once you've normalized your candidate pool and said, okay, everyone here is actually qualified, then what really comes next? And this is where the interaction between mission becomes so significant. So there are very few schools that we've seen that actually say in their mission statements, we don't have discipline issues in a mission statement. That would be very unusual. And that's actually exactly what I want to look at momentarily, is just to take a look at what's unusual in the admissions process. So when you look at things like what's important to us in our mission statements, and we look at the admissions standards and the admissions profiles and the admissions protocols, these are things that don't pop up. And that may be very telling to us. So if these things are important to us in our mission, and I know they are because we've looked at lots of different mission statements before, what are some of the things that we might really focus on? And should we change, or at least focus on, some of the language that we use to really match up our admissions and our mission? So let's take a look at some things. So when we look at how we might try and measure someone who's going to be a good fit for us in our civic engagement, what do we see that might indicate leadership? What do we see that might indicate that a student has a proclivity to lead a productive life, or might make contributions in our school and later on? What elements are there that really get at the hard choices that kids have to make, or how mature they are, or how willing they might be to serve others, which is absolutely part of our mission statement? Pretty interesting. And another question is, do we pay as much attention to these elements as we do to the more common elements? I'd be willing to say that no, we actually don't. We actually pay a lot more attention to these because they tend to be easier to measure. And now this is true not just in admissions. So this is this glaring statement I warned you about at the beginning that you're happily able to reject and come back with and ask questions about and really push as much as you want to. But one of the things that we've seen across the board, whether it's talking about admissions or anything, strategic planning and really trying to measure what matters most, is we do a good job at measuring things that are easier to measure. And the things that are harder to measure, we don't always do a good job doing. Now, in looking ahead at something else, I'd like to point out in the last 2 years, since we've also gathered a whole bunch of strategic plans and strategic ideas of what schools are up to, we know some of the big things that they're doing. So in the last 2 years, what percentage of strategic goals have been about admissions? Right? I'll ask you one more time. In the last 2 years, what percentage of strategic goals have been about admissions in some way, shape, or form? The answer might blow you away, but it's 40%. So that's a big number. That is a very large number about that really talks about admissions. So let's move on to something more practical, because it's all well and good to talk about how the mission statement might interact with admissions. But let's talk about really the candidate pool. And you've probably seen some of these things, and if you followed some NAIS, read the trend book, or just been around for a while, that NAIS has defined these types of high-income parents. So I'll rely a little bit on some trend book data here, and part of a big survey from just a few years ago. That these are some of the high-income parents, which is defined as earning between $175,000 and $200,000 a year, which tend to be the type of parent, or the level of parent that we're looking for. So these 5 groups are breakdown this way. Public school proponents are loyal to public schools, and only about 20% actually would consider attending a non-public school. So I should have said these percentages here are actually what percentage of these parents would consider, or highly consider, I should say, attending an independent school. So we've got our public school proponents, just as ways of defining it. Special kids, these are children with special needs, whether they're learning or behavioral issues. We can see about 26% there. We can see parents who push. You can see they really want this top-notch, and they're not nearly as concerned with whether it's public or private. They are very results-oriented, and really just want to know exactly what you're going to give them. And then the success-driven parents, of course, these are absolutely focused on top-tier colleges. And we've got a little note here, these from NAIS and some of our research as well about how to message to these parents as well. And finally, the character building ones, the 17% overall. They're in independent schools already, and they are really very focused on. I think they're very focused on some of the mission imperatives that we'd really like. So let me give you this snapshot here so that you can see it. I know this is a lot of data, and if you've read the trend book, you're already really familiar with this. But these 5 categories, the green here indicates that they definitely would consider an independent school, and then the other colors are probably, might or might not, probably not, and definitely not. And so you can see out of this big survey that was published in the trend book a few years ago, the Parent Motivation Survey, where all these green things are that they might consider. And as I mentioned, when you look at this, so the 800 are general parents, are parents in general, but when you look at parents who are actually already in our schools, you'll note that the character building parents and the parents who push and the success they are already in our schools at a pretty high level. So let me show you this next slide here, because it extrapolates some of this data so we get a slightly different picture. Okay. So in the first row across, in the study, what percentage of parents were actually represented in the study? Okay, it's parents who push 10%. All right. In the second row, would they definitely consider? You can see, okay, they're 33%. And then as a percentage of the total of respondents, where do they fall out? You can see 3%. And then finally, how well represented are they in independent schools? And this is what I really want to draw your attention to, that the success-driven parents and the character-building parents, they're already here in droves. They make up about 70% of our current composition. Now, these are things that you probably already knew about. But here's a new point that does contradict some of the data that's come out. Some of the data says that tuition pricing and admissions are really single variate types of things. But we're actually pretty convinced that these are there are multiple variations, and that the decision to enroll in an independent school is a multivariate problem, because there are lots of different motivators. And I want to talk just a little bit about some of the multiple variables of whether or not to enroll. Right? So these are three basic things. And we'll start off with the idea of demographics. So sorry about that. Who is there really who might attend your school? So who's out there, and what's the pond that you can fish in? So demographic studies are things that help you all quite a bit in your own work. These are things that you know about as well, that you probably live and die by quite a bit, and you and your head of school and the board look at pretty carefully to see what is in your market and who can afford what you're trying to provide. And the second is this idea of the competition. So who else is out there? And sometimes we worry about this too much, and sometimes we don't worry about it quite enough. These are just some of the competitors. Maybe you talk to your market pretty closely. Maybe you don't talk to other people in your market very closely. But these are things that you know about. And I'll tell you that in some states, the charter movement has taken off, and the voucher movements have taken off in such a way that they really do pose a significant cause for concern. I know that some of our independent school members will routinely just ignore it, and I'm not sure that that's wise. I do think that paying attention to the competition is something that really does help, and then establishing your own value narrative within your market and identifying how you differentiate yourself, and then of course carrying that through in your admissions is what we're really here to talk about some. Finally, that gets us to your own school's programs and what you're really geared towards. So what is it that your competition can't do that you can do? And how is it that you can continue to adhere to your own mission as you go through the process? I want to show you a picture of the artist's rendering of the school whose mission is to enrich minds and inspire dreams. It is a real school. It does exist, and it's a K-5 and elementary school in a pretty good market. It's at the upper end of cost and expense, and anything that you might have thought about it initially is probably true. Very motivated families, very high income earners, and a very student-focused environment. And as a K-5 school, strong enough that the area independent schools pitch to it quite a bit all the time to try and encourage the students to go to their high schools. So a very good independent school whose mission is very simple and very straightforward. And through the admissions process, this is really who they're looking for to match up with their mission. Now, I know that we've got mission statements in all of our own schools, but there's something that one of the consultants out in the world said once, and I wrote it down and I always hold on to it, and it's the mission that we feel like we serve. We feel like we serve the mission to educate the children of the chronically anxious. So there is a synthesis between what we're trying to accomplish in our mission and how we might get that across through admissions. And really the whole point of the conversation today is just to look at some of the data that's out there and some of the research and see what people might be doing that they're not doing. So I'll share with you a couple of final thoughts on this that we saw. We did see in reading through the material that several schools have developed scoring rubrics where they take the different aspects of their mission and they will score students based on a 1, 3, or a 5, where a 5 says they're a very good fit with that aspect of their mission, a 3 says they're, so-so, más o menos, and a 1 says, it's really not a good mission fit. And after having done this for several years, they've been able to establish that there's some validity in using that as a measure. So a composite score of a student will tell them, are they likely to be a good mission fit or not? And part of that comes from being willing to interview families as well as just the student, but stretching out into interviewing families, whether it's parents, brothers, sisters, and really understanding that there's an entire family dynamic that might help establish just how good of a fit they are for a school. Another thing that we saw, as we saw buried in someone's documentation, we saw that they actually have a document that's called the Mission Appropriate Student, where they also lay out all their mission imperatives, and like the other school that has a 1, 3, or 5, they do a narrative commentary on each student for the harder to measure areas, and then they take that into their admissions committee meetings and try and tease that out. So some of this is never going to go away. Some of the checkbox elements of it, which try to measure, is a child the academic fit, yes or no. But once we get beyond that, I guess the point of today is to really advocate for understanding that your mission is a dynamic thing, and you all are really on the front lines of establishing the school to the wider public. You know that they come to you first. Of course, they go to the website first, or go to friends, or the Kroger Mafia. But once they get to you, you know that your role is to continue to push the mission out there. And being able to say through the admissions process, that's really what we're looking for. It's not just about outputs, but it's also about inputs. So Karen, I'm hopeful that we've got some questions at this point, and I'd definitely like to say that anyone's certainly happy to continue this conversation outside of the auspices of this webinar in any way that someone would like to. We really enjoy talking about mission, and we talk about it quite a lot through the SEIS network and through the accreditation process, and certainly as it has to deal with the front door of admissions. But thanks very much, and I'm hopeful there are some questions. Karen?
Hi, Damien. The first question is, the process that you undertook to gather this data and sort of synthesize it, was it more anecdotal, or did it have a direct connection to accreditation viewpoint?
It's a direct connection to accreditation. So what we did is we looked at the last 2 years. We thought 2 years was long enough to look back. We actually collect, the way we collect accreditation information is through an online tool, our SAIS accreditation portal. So if there are SAIS schools on the call, they'll probably be on the webinar, they'll probably be familiar with it. But essentially what it does is it allows a school to address the particular indicator in an online portal that really is a database, but it does some fancy things where it allows them to upload evidence and to compile the report in a nice, neat fashion. It's still an open-ended narrative response that schools give when they respond to the indicator and to the standard, but it's looked at and it's reviewed by the accreditation team for validity to make sure that, yeah, they are in fact doing what they say they're doing. But what we're able to do on the back end is able to look at it at the indicator level, so we can look at a snapshot of the way that 100 schools, 150 schools answered that particular indicator over the last couple of years. And this provides us, when we look at all 56 indicators, believe me, that's kind of a lot to do, and we tend to do it over the summer. But when we look at it and analyze it and do some narrative analysis on it, we can start to spot both best practices or most effective practices as they are or as they're changing, and we can also spot trends. So if we really begin to see that more schools are doing one thing or another, or are lacking in one thing or another, we can wrap some professional development around that. So I think the question was about the process that we went through, and because of the way that we collect information, it lends itself to some pretty good analysis. We also do some analysis with visit reports that we get back, and our visit reports respond to strategic plans and a growth mindset of schools, and we're also able to do some analysis on that.
Okay, thank you. Kristen is asking what types of surveys you use, school climate survey, parent survey, faculty surveys, etc.
So we're going to dig really deeply into that at the SSATBE conference, but I'll share it with you. What we did is we actually, about 3 or 4 years ago, we started talking about this idea of the value narrative and what it might really mean to schools to continue to define it. It's not new terms, not new concepts, but we really talked about it in terms of, what is it that you're doing that not only does your families believe that you should be doing, but they think that you're doing well. So what we did is we created a couple of we created a survey instrument. It took us about 18 months to create it, and then to run reliability and validity tests on it. We created this survey that's deliverable to 6 or 7 different stakeholder groups in a school. What it does is it really tries to establish. Let's ask these series of basic questions. On an intensity scale, how important are a variety of normal characteristics to you as a family? So, for example, the first one talks about, a pretty old concept for us, academic rigor. Okay, so if we can understand how important is academic rigor to lots of different stakeholder groups, that's good. And then we can say, well, how well do you perceive that the school is performing at delivering on that same characteristic? And by using the same intensity scale, we can actually compare those two things together. So not only can we say, all right, in this list of 28 or so normal characteristics, we know what ranks most highly amongst different stakeholder groups, and we know what everybody says you're doing well among the same groups. But we can also link them together and see, are you in congruence or not? So this congruency measure is really all about your value narrative. If you think about it, if you're doing something, if something is really valued highly by your community and you're doing really well at delivering on it, then that is your value narrative. And by the same token, if something's not important and you're not doing a good job of it, you may ask yourself this basic question, well, why am I doing that? Or why am I putting so much effort into it? We also ask a couple of demographic questions on the front end, and on the back end we ask this question that's called the Net Promoter question, which is on a scale of 1 to 10, how likely are you to recommend the school to friends and colleagues? And the science behind this question is really great. Once you subdivide how they answer that question, you can see pretty clearly that the people who are loyal to the school answer things in one way, and the people who are what are called detractors or negative Nellies, they answer these questions in a very different way. So you actually get a really good snapshot and overview of what people really like about you and what people don't really like about you. And the idea behind that particular value narrative survey is to try to start establishing how can you affect some change if you do in fact need to affect some change, and where are the subgroups, because we can go pretty deeply in to subgroups, whether it's amongst the student group, alumni group, parents or alumni parents, trustees, faculty. So it's a pretty neat thing, and as more and more schools are participating in it, I don't know, there have been maybe 10,000 or so respondents so far, but as more and more schools participate in it, the overall norming process and benchmarking process gets better and better. And like I say, at the conference, that's what the session I'm giving at the conference is going to be all about.
Excellent, thank you. The next question has to do, I guess, more with proportion when you did undertake this study, what proportion of schools did you find were utilizing measures in admission that closely correlated with their school's missions, and what proportion of schools were not?
Yeah, thanks. Whoever asked that, thank you so much for asking that, because we were actually kind of disturbed by that. That was one of the questions we set out to answer, and we were actually a little disturbed by the response that we found up understanding that it's actually a really small number that are really incorporating mission into admissions. But it seems like it's one of the most basic things that you'd want to do. But actually doing it and trying to metric it out in a school there's a really low proportion of schools that are doing it, and the types of schools that are doing it didn't really surprise us too much. That that some of the schools that have more, I guess, distinct missions, whether it's a religiously affiliated school or a school that serves a special needs population, those are mission imperatives that tend to determine admissions very closely. So once we removed those from the study and really looked at just the true blue secular or quasi-secular independent school or non-denominational religious school, and really looked at that group, it did catch us off guard and surprise us a little bit how few were actually trying to incorporate mission as a very specific and intentional component in their school. And in their school's admissions process. So that's an area of growth for schools, I think, because I do think that there's value in making sure that you're really paying attention to your mission and paying attention to it in all phases of school and in all aspects of school life, whether it's from the portrait of the candidate to the portrait of the graduate to the portrait of the faculty member. If those are that's a pretty common thing to use, and that's one way to help determine and help define who you're looking for. And I think it does intersect and triangulate nicely with the concept of establishing what your value narrative is. The further benefit of that is, of course, to establish your own uniqueness in your marketplace, because we know that there are great pressures that that this group's under to perform and to deliver. But it's a whole school issue that really is determined, I think, from the mission statement and should spread forth from the mission statement.
Thank you. Considering the results that you did receive from that study, are there plans to create some kind of a procedure or a process, a rubric that schools can use to more closely align their admission practices with their school's missions?
So actually, one of the things that we've got planned for this summer is, and we've done this before, and we'll do this every so often, is we call it the Accreditation Summit. We're inviting about a dozen or so of our people who've chaired visits or served on a number of visits before to come in and really help us analyze all the data that we've got, because there's a tremendous amount of data and information here. And what our goal is we'd like to establish better, I guess a good way to put it is better help and better guidance in addressing standards at the minute level, at the indicator level, not as requirements, but as suggested suggestions of how, based on what others are doing and what really we might think high caliber schools are doing, what we might see and be able to push out there as most effective practices as validated through accreditation, through and by Accreditation Research. I think a lot of, I don't know if this is true or not, but I have a gut feeling that most best practices that are out there, whether it's at the national or association level or wherever it might be, tend to be, hey, yeah, that's how we think it should be done, so that's how we're going to do it. But it would be nice to start from, hey, look, we can actually establish how about 100 schools or 200 schools are doing it, and we can redact from that down to what might be more effective practices. I think part of the danger of that whole sphere is the I don't know how much you might lock a school into adhering to this strict interpretation of some practices. And we've always been very concerned to make sure that independent schools know they are in fact independent. And within the mission framework and within the guidelines of what it means to be an SAIS member school, we'd like to make sure that all of the schools are adhering to the most effective measures and ways of doing things. So this summer we'll be doing that work, and we will produce some help documents for accreditation, and I'm quite certain that we'll have some pretty specific, we call them lunch and learn sessions, or sessions at our conference, or sessions at a variety of other places, where we continue to report on the research and continue to report on what we've seen, as well as some articles that come out in a variety of sources.
That sounds great, Damien. Thank you. We are at the end of our questions and almost at the end of our time, so this is actually a very good time to wrap up. If you'd just like to say a couple of parting words, and I'll do the exit for you.
Well, thank you all very much for hanging in there. Really do appreciate it, and appreciate the opportunity to hang out with our good friends at SSATBE. SAIS is around to serve schools. We generally like to say that we do three things. We defend schools' right to be independent, hopefully keep people connected to each other, and hopefully keep everyone informed about what will help you fulfill your mission. So thanks again, and Karen, I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. I want to thank our audience for tuning in, and a special thank you to Damien for providing us with this insightful webinar. Just a reminder, a recording of this presentation will be made available on the webinar page in the professional development section on admission.org, most likely tomorrow, and I will send a link to that page to everyone who registered for the webinar. Thanks again, and have a wonderful day.